Hey everyone, welcome to this webinar on boldface questions. So a bit of information about me. My name is Matoo. I'm an economics master's graduate from the University of Amsterdam, and I really enjoy standardized tests. I know that's like the nerdiest thing to say, but I do enjoy standardized tests, mostly because I see it as sort of a puzzle. I see it as something that, is a system that you can game and take advantage of. Right? And because of that, I did the GMAT, I did the GRE, I got great scores on them. But I realized I didn't want to go to business school. What I actually like doing is teaching. So, I taught at Crack Verbal full time for nearly 2 years. Right now, I still help out with Crack Verbal with, some of the classes on the weekends, as well as these webinars on occasion. But my primary profession is that I teach history and geography at an international school at the middle school level. So, clearly the thing that I enjoy the most is teaching, and I enjoy sharing and exchanging knowledge. So hopefully this next hour will be, productive for you on that front. Just a little bit about Crack Verbal. If you haven't, if you're not already joined, we've made, loads and loads of videos. We've had, if you add up the students and the hours that they have sat with us, we've taught for over 1,000,000 hours. I think that's pretty impressive. And, essentially our goal is that we want to connect the people who enjoy teaching the most. And that's part of why I worked at Crack Verbal myself. And students who are motivated or interested in, sort of I don't want to say prolonging because all of you are still fairly young, I assume. We have an online course, which of course, a lot of you are familiar with. If you haven't joined, you can check out the online course at gmatonline.crackverbal.com. And, you can maybe do a few of the demo lessons and see what it's like. We also have a bunch of ebooks, very useful, and they're short reads. I know it says ebook, but it's actually a very short read. And, I know I don't have the best attention span myself. It's something that you should be able to get through fairly easily. In addition to this, we have videos, right? Again, if you're like me, even more than an ebook, you probably learn well by watching videos. There's plenty of strategy videos out there at youtube.com/user/crackverbalvideos, right? Tons of videos and very useful tips out there. Cool, now that we've got all of the admin work out of the way, let's get started with this webinar itself, which is of course about boldface questions. So what is the boldface question anyway, right? The simple answer is that it is a question with some parts of it in bold, right? So that's fairly straightforward. Sorry, I'm just gonna pause a second because somebody asked where you get the free books from. My bad. You can just check out the link here. So gmat.crackverbal.com/free resources/ebook library. All of the words, the gaps between words are hyphenated. So you can check that out over there. In addition to this, this webinar will eventually be made available on YouTube itself. So you should be able to find the information without too much of a hassle. Cool. So what is the boldface question? As the name suggests, the boldface question is a question for which part of the question is marked in bold, right? In fact, in almost all boldface questions that you'll see on the GMAT, you have two sentences marked in bold, which are obviously both part of the argument. So you get an argument, you get two statements marked in bold, and you have a bunch of different options. So if you take a look at this question here, it says, observations of the Shoemaker-Levy comet on its collision course with Jupiter show that the comet broke into fragments before entering Jupiter's atmosphere in 1994, but they didn't show how big those fragments were. In hopes of gaining some indication of the fragment size, astronomers studied spectrographic analyses of Jupiter's outer atmosphere. These analyses revealed unprecedented traces of sulfur after the fragment's entry. The fragments themselves almost certainly contain no sulfur, but many astronomers believe that the cloud layer below Jupiter's outer atmosphere does contain sulfur. And that's one of the bolded statements. Since sulfur would have seeped into the outer atmosphere if common fragments had penetrated this outer layer, it is likely that some of the fragments were at least large enough to have passed through Jupiter's outer atmosphere without being burned up, right? So this is essentially what your average boldface question looks like. There's two parts that are marked in bold. And the question goes, in the astronomer's argument, since the astronomer is the one making this argument, the two portions in boldface play which of the following roles, right? And you have 5 options, just like you do with any GMAT question, right? Well, boldface questions are often a type of question that confuses a lot of people. And, you know, if not confuses, there seems to be this kind of cult status. Like people tell me, you know, hey, these boldface questions look like they're really hard and I can't really make sense of them. And there's a fear. And honestly, I believe that this fear has, in part at least, contributed to, you know, the way we perceive the difficulty of boldface questions. Because if I'm being very honest, they're not that hard. Once you recognize what you need to do in order to solve a boldface question, it gets exponentially easier. However, right, if you don't really know what to do, or if all you have is, you know, this question and you're trying to figure out where to start, yes, it can be a little bit daunting, particularly because it appears at least not to be anything like any of the other CR questions, right? They're not asking you to find a conclusion. They're not asking you to, you know, give some kind of statement that could make the argument stronger or weaker. You simply have an argument and you're supposed to analyze what that argument is composed of. And yes, indeed, that can be quite challenging. So let's actually try to dive into what an argument is first. Let's take a step back from the question and try and figure out what an argument is first before we dive into actually trying to solve some of these kinds of questions. So what does an argument look like, right? If you're already part of the course, you know, if you're sat in on any of the classroom sessions or the online videos, you may have already seen this, but it's worth the recap. An argument is composed of premises, assumptions, and a conclusion. So you have premises, which are essentially the true facts that have been given to us. So any statement that we're being told is simply a true fact, that's a premise. A conclusion is the thing that the author is trying to convince us of, all right? And an assumption is just like a premise, but it is an unsaid statement which helps lead to the conclusion. So if we had to put that into a formula, right, we have premises and assumptions make up a conclusion. Premises can be best interpreted as the facts that we already know because they've been given to us by the argument. Assumptions are things that the argument considers facts, but the argument hasn't gone out of its way to state these facts to come to whatever conclusion. The conclusion is also stated, and the conclusion is something that the argument is trying to convince us of. So let's say your argument goes, you know, Matoo scored a 750 on the GMAT, therefore Matoo will get into Harvard. The premise there is that Matoo scored a 750. That's just a fact that has been given to you. The conclusion, which is the thing that the argument is trying to convince us of, is that Matoo will get into Harvard. We don't know if I will get into Harvard or not, right? But within this, there are also facts that must be true, but are not really stated. One of the facts here would be that the GMAT score is actually the main relevant factor for deciding whether you will get admission or not, right? Or to put this even more blatantly, that I didn't do anything else to sabotage my application. So what if I get a 750 on the GMAT, but then on my Harvard application, I write, suck it, I'm too good for this. Well, obviously I'm not going to get into Harvard there, right? So what an assumption would be is that I didn't do that. The assumption here is that I sent in my application in a normal way, hoping to actually get selected. That's a true fact. It's not stated, but it's still a true fact that helps us come to the conclusion, right? So essentially, there are these 3 major parts: the premises, the assumption or assumptions, and the conclusion. But there are really 4 elements, all right? So we have the premises, which are the true facts, the conclusion, which the author is trying to convince us of, the assumptions, which are the unsaid statements. But lastly, we also care about the validity of the argument. Now, what do I mean by this? What I mean is that if we're trying to solve a strengthen the argument question versus a weaken the argument question, Well, the premises are going to be the same. The conclusion is going to be the same. The assumptions that we might think about might be very similar. But ultimately, with a strengthen the argument question, we are trying to find something that will make the argument more valid. In a weaken the argument question, we're trying to find an assumption that will make the argument less valid. In an inference-based CR question, we're trying to pick some statement, pick some conclusion that will always be valid no matter what. In a resolve the paradox question, we get a conclusion that appears to be not valid, but since we are resolving the paradox, we are trying to explain how that argument is actually valid in the first place. So what that means is that even though we don't say it outright, validity is ultimately a key part of the argument as well, right? So we have premises, we have conclusions, we have assumptions, and we have the validity, which is a metaphor, a metaphysical thing that we want to think about. It's not an actual physical thing present in the argument, but it still matters. All right, some of you have asked me to put the PPT in presentation mode. You know what, I can do that, but it affects the, let me see if there's something else I can do about that. Okay, this is, I hope this is a little bit larger. What tends to happen is that when I put it in presentation mode, Zoom doesn't seem to be optimized for the Mac in the way that I would like for it to be, because I'm not able, like if it is in presentation mode, I'm not able to access the polls as easily and open them up and offer them to you in the same way. So hopefully this is, a more appropriate compromise. I think the screen is at least, big enough that it is, as visible as possible. All right, I don't see any other questions that have come in, so I'm going to move forward. Now, we went through what an argument is and the fact that there's many elements to consider. So that could be a little bit daunting. I'm going to make up for that by giving you the good news. In assumption-based CR questions, right, like find the assumption or strengthen the argument or weaken the argument or evaluate the conclusion, right? If you don't know what these types of questions are and you're not a student yet, don't worry. These are just certain types of CR questions that exist. And for these questions, you need to care about all of the elements of the argument. You need to care about what the premises have to say. You need to care about the conclusion. You need to care about the assumptions, because they're assumption-based questions. And depending on what you're being asked to do, you have to care about the validity as well. So the premises and the assumptions come together to make the conclusion, and we're always looking to make the argument more valid or less valid, or with an evaluate question, you want to be able to make it both more and less valid, depending on how you answer it, right? So you have to care about all of this stuff. On the other hand, when we look at content-based CR questions, which you can classify as inference or paradox-based questions, we still care about the premises and the conclusion. In fact, those matter tremendously. And you're looking to help the validity of the argument, because with an inference question, you need an argument that is 100% valid. With a paradox question, the argument appears to be not valid to start with, but actually is. So you do care about helping the validity of the argument along. But with these questions, the assumptions stop mattering. So instead of 4 elements, we only have to look out for 3. And that makes your job, I won't say easier, but it makes it less multidimensional. So that's obviously kind of nice. And you know what? When you move on to structure-based CR questions, which are really just boldface questions, right? It gets even better, because the validity of the argument doesn't matter at all. Since it is a structure-based question, we don't care about what that structure actually looks like. We just care about the building blocks that are part of that structure, right? So if you think of the premises and the conclusions as like Lego pieces that you put together to make an argument, we don't care whether that thing that you've put together is a bridge or that thing that you've put together is a pit into hell. It works absolutely just fine. We don't care whether the astronomer's argument here is a valid argument. It could make sense, it could make no sense at all, and it doesn't affect the way that we got to answer the question. So that's really good news for us. All that really matters is the premises and the conclusion or conclusions within the argument. The premises, because they are the true facts that are given to us in the argument. So some of these statements are inevitably going to be premises. We care about the conclusion because we care about what statement might be a conclusion, because we need to identify these building blocks. We need to identify and say this building block is a premise, this building block is a conclusion. Assumptions don't matter because assumptions are unsaid statements. If they're unsaid, they're not in the argument. So why do we care whether it's an assumption or not? Doesn't matter. Validity. We're not looking for a statement that can tell us that the argument is valid. We're simply looking at the statements and trying to identify what these statements are in the first place. So if we say that, this statement is a conclusion or this statement is a premise, really those are the only two types of things a statement can be. And that makes our job a whole lot easier, because in every CR question, right, in every CR argument, and this goes even beyond boldface, but it applies specifically to boldface, the only types of statements that can exist are premises and conclusions. So let's take a look at an argument here. And in fact, this is also an actual boldface question. So the bits that are in bold, those statements are the original bolded statements. So let's read this, right? Students who do well on the GMAT typically drink Red Bull during the break. There are a lot of students who have done well while taking Red Bull. However, recent studies have shown that taking Red Bull can actually be bad for concentration, and that the students who took Red Bull and scored high could have scored higher if they had not taken it. Hence, it is incorrect to believe that Red Bull can help your performance on the GMAT. Cool. Now, what we might recognize here is that all of these statements must either be premises or conclusions, right? So let's start with any argument, and this applies to all CR arguments. Let's start by trying to identify the conclusion. What is it that the argument is trying to convince us of, right? And here, it is the last statement. Hence, it is incorrect to believe that Red Bull can help your performance. They're trying to convince us that Red Bull isn't really going to help our performance on the GMAT. So we can say that that statement is a conclusion. Now let's move forward. Let's move back to the other statements and start to categorize them. Students who do well on the GMAT typically drink Red Bull during the break. All right, well, that's obviously a premise. It's just giving us a fact. It's not trying to convince us of anything. So that's just a premise right there. But is this premise supporting the conclusion? Not really, right? Students who do well on the GMAT typically drink Red Bull. If I were to read that statement, that would be the kind of statement that would actually lead me to think that Red Bull can help my performance. So since this statement goes in the opposite direction of the conclusion, we now know that, well, okay, there's conclusions and there's premises, but we can split the conclusions and we can split the premise statements into two parts as well. And now we have a quadrant. So the first statement, right? Statement number one, let's see if I can annotate. Cool, I can do that. So statement number one, students who do well on the GMAT typically drink Red Bull during the break. That's a premise, so it's on this side, but it goes against the main conclusion. So I'm gonna put a 1 here to say that this statement is a premise that goes against. There are a lot of students who have done well while taking Red Bull. Well, that too is a premise, and that also goes against the argument. So let's put a 2 here as well to say that that too is a premise that goes against the argument. However, recent studies have shown that taking Red Bull can actually be bad for concentration. Now, just a word of advice here, because sometimes people think of these statements to be the conclusion because it's something that a study has concluded. But anything that a study has shown us is now something. So we would then have to say that that is also a premise statement. The study is telling us this. So it's a fact, right? And this is a fact which actually tells us that taking Red Bull is bad for you. It's not going to help you. So we can put statement number 3 as a premise that supports the argument. If we look at statement number 4, it says, students who took Red Bull and scored high could have scored higher if they had not taken it. Now that too would be another fact, which is leading us to the main conclusion. It is supporting the main conclusion. So we can put that down here as number 4. And number 5, which is the second bolded statement. Hence, it is incorrect to believe that Red Bull can help your performance on the GMAT, which is the main conclusion here. Now, on a boldface question, you can also have the argument present multiple conclusions, and you have the main conclusion versus conclusions that might, disagree with the main conclusion in some way. Maybe not outright against, but conclusions that disagree with. And we will look at a question in which that happens. But for now, it was enough for us to see that, well, we broke down each statement, each of the building blocks, and we were able to identify every single building block as being part of one section of these quadrants, right? So every single statement, no matter how complicated a statement might look, no matter what a statement might say in an argument, you can ultimately categorize it into one of these four categories. Either it is a premise that supports the main argument, or it is a premise that goes against the main argument, or it is the main argument. It is what the author is trying to convince us of. So it's the main conclusion, or it's a separate conclusion, one that goes against or one that differs from the main conclusion of the argument. Every single statement can be categorized like this. So that's really good for us, right? I mean, now we know the bolded statements are 1 and 5. So statement number 1 is a premise that goes against the conclusion. Statement 2, which is the fifth statement, is the main conclusion of the argument. So premise that goes against the main conclusion and main conclusion of the argument. Very straightforward, right? Super, super easy to figure out what's going on there. But there are two things that can make this a little bit challenging. And what are they? One, the answer choices use phrases or words that make it sound really confusing. So if you look at the answer choices will not be as simple as saying the first is a premise against the conclusion, the second is a conclusion. That's very good for us to be able to do, but it doesn't the answer is not necessarily worded like that. So the answer choices are deliberately made confusing to read. Two, the actual conclusion of the author is hidden by providing an intermediate conclusion or just by making the wording complex so that we're not sure about the conclusion. Now, for those of you who are already, somewhat into your CR prep, you've probably seen that happen with other CR questions as well. Whether it's assumption-based questions or paradox-based questions, the conclusion of the author can be sometimes hidden by cheeky or tricky use of wording. So that's something that can happen regardless. But trap number 1 is something that is very specific to boldface questions. So let's take a look at that first. So what did we see? We saw the first was a premise that went against. The second was the main conclusion. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at the correct answer to the Red Bull question, right? So what does it say here? It says the first is a premise presented to support a position against an argument that is supported by the author. And the second presents an objection to that position. And if you read this firstly, right, like no one talks like this, right? Like you can have friends in a social life, or you can talk like this, but you can't do both. So like this is absolutely nuts, right? What do you do when you see something like this? And by the way, this is the correct answer, right? This is the right answer to the question, which we thought was so simple. Premise against, conclusion main. So what do we do when we see something like this, right? What we have to do is actually not just look at the question and categorize the statements as what they are. So of course, when you see a question, you look at the first bolded statement, figure out what it is. You look at the second bolded statement, figure out what it is. I did it for the other statements just to show that you can, but really you've got to do it just for bold statement 1 and bold statement 2. But what you also have to do now is you have to take the wording of the answer choice and also put that into one of these 4 quadrants to see whether it matches or not. So let's do that for this particular option. The first is a premise. Cool, so far so good. We know that it's not in the conclusion side, it has to be in the premise side. Fantastic. Presented to support a position. Okay, hold on a second. Isn't every premise presented to support a position? I mean, in an argument, what is a premise? A premise is a true fact which leads towards a conclusion, leads towards a position. So that's just word salad. They've just put that in there to mess with you. The first is a premise presented to support a position against an argument supported by the author. Okay, so it's supporting a position against the author's argument. So the first is a premise and it is supporting the argument against the author's argument. Cool. So that, in fact, this whole complicated sentence here is actually just telling us, well, the first is a premise against. The second presents an objection to that position. All right, so they threw in the pronouns as well, right, to make it even more complicated. The second is an objection to that position. Okay, so what do we do now, right? When we say that it is an objection, so a premise is a premise. But even if you say the first is a finding, the first is data, the first is an observation, the first is a fact, the first is evidence. I mean, not the first, but any of these things, right? Observations, facts, data, findings, evidence, consideration, right? Premise itself. All of these are just fancy code words for premise, because all of them are just telling you, oh, this is a fact. So that means it's just a premise. That's all you got to think about. Now, when we say an objection, well, if you have an objection to something, that means that you are trying to present your own point of view here. You are trying to present your own position here. And that even makes it clear when they say an objection to that position. So a position is obviously an argument. A position is a conclusion, because the position is your opinion based on the facts. If you're saying that there's an objection to the position, that means that you are taking a position that goes against that other position. Now, that may be what it is, but the simple thing that you can do here is say, well, okay, that means the word position, that means the word objection, that means the word conclusion, that means the word course, the words course of action, right? These are all words that are talking about the conclusion of an argument. So when we say the second presents an objection, we now know that they're talking about a conclusion, an objection to that position. What position? Well, position against argument supported by the author. So position against the author's argument. And if we're objecting to that, well, that's just a double negative, and we come back to the author's argument itself. So the second presents an objection to that position is really just saying the second is the author's argument, because it's objecting to the argument that is against the author. Enemy of my enemy is my friend. We come back to the second is the main conclusion. So this question might be worded in a very tricky way, or this answer option may be worded in a very tricky way, but ultimately it comes down to saying the first is a premise against the author's argument, and the second is objecting to that argument that's against the author's argument. So the second is in fact the author's argument itself, right? So no matter how complicated this looked, it ultimately came all the way back to, we had to take the bolded statements and put them in, categorize them into these quadrants, and we had to take the answer options and categorize them into the quadrants as well, right? So an objection, yes. So I'm just going to take a question now. If you have any other questions, you can put them forward as well. Does the word objection mean against? Yes, it absolutely does, right? If you're objecting to something, it means you're going against that thing that you are objecting to, right? So the second presents an objection to that position. It is a position that is going against that position, right? So ultimately, no matter how complicated the wording might be, your job now is to actually take the wording of an answer option and categorize that into the quadrants, just as you would categorize the original statements into the quadrants as well, right? So that's trap number one, right? The answer wording is tricky and it is confusing, and I fully accept that. The answer wording is tricky and confusing, but what you got to do now is take the wording of the answer options and put them in these boxes as well, because like we've seen, no matter what the argument may say or the statements in the argument say, we can categorize them into one of these four. Similarly, no matter what an answer option might say, we can still categorize it into one of these four quadrants, or one of these four boxes. Cool. Now let's take a look at trap number two. Or you know what? I see some chats coming in. You can send your questions in over the next couple of minutes. I'll take those questions and then we'll move on. All right, so one of the questions is it possible that CR questions will involve SC tricks like the which rule? It is, so what I would say to that is that sentence correction is trying to test you on something very different in the first place. Uh, if you mean that they use the word which to mean the immediately preceding noun or noun phrase, yes, that can happen, but it is very unlikely and it will be more obvious. The figuring out what the meaning of the sentence is based on the grammar of the sentence is not something you should be particularly concerned about with CR questions. The grammar in CR questions is generally much more straightforward. The challenge that you're going to deal with is really picking apart the argument itself. Don't worry too much about the SC related skills while you're trying to solve a CR based question. Another question has come in as well. How much time do you foresee in doing the trial and error quadrant analysis with the 5 options? Okay, so ultimately a boldface question should take you about 2 minutes is what I would say. It can take you up to 2.5, but really 2 minutes is kind of fine. And the reason that 2 minutes is enough is because when you go through the answer option, if you find that statement 1 is wrong for answer options A, B, and D, you don't even have to look at statement 2 for answer options A, B, and D. You only have to look at statement 2 for answer options C and E. So that makes your job a lot easier because the moment you find even the slightest discrepancy, you can go ahead and eliminate the answer. And that's really what you're trying to do. You're trying to eliminate answers. You're not trying to pick an answer that you think is correct. You're trying to eliminate 4 answers that have made mistakes with them, right? So it should ideally not really take you more than 2 minutes to do it. However, if it does take you up to about 2 minutes, 15 seconds, 2.5 minutes, even up to 3 minutes for a very difficult question, I would say that this is not cause for concern because even though CR questions should take you 1.8 to 2 minutes on average, boldface questions, you'll get like 1, maybe 2 of them on the test. That's not so many that it can actually cause you serious trouble regarding time management. So don't worry about that too much. If it's taking you more than 3 minutes, then of course you need to practice so that you can get a little bit faster and more efficient with that. All right, I'm going to take a drink of water and then we'll progress with the second challenge. All right. So the second challenge that we identified was that the main conclusion of the argument can be quite difficult to get at, right? And this can happen with boldface questions. This can happen with other types of questions as well. But I want to give you all an example of a particularly difficult and complicated kind of argument. All right, so this one goes. In countries where health insurance includes compensation for allergic reactions to prescribed medicines, reports of having suffered such allergies are twice as frequent as they are in countries where allergic reaction is not covered. Some analysts have argued correctly that since there is presently no conclusive test for medical allergy, bogus reports of medical allergies cannot be easily identified. These analysts are, however, wrong to draw the further conclusion that in the countries with the higher rates of reported allergic reactions, half the reported cases are bogus. Clearly, in countries where health insurance does not include compensation for allergic reaction, people often have little incentive to report medical allergies that they actually have suffered. Now, I'm going to give you all a minute, and I just want you to answer the first question for me, which is how many conclusions are there? So you can put your answers in on the chat. I'll give you like 60 seconds to do so, right? And then we'll get into how we can identify these conclusions themselves. All right, I've seen a couple of answers come in, and some people, I just muted my microphone in the meantime. Um, a bunch of you are now saying that there are two conclusions. And you know what? All of you are saying there's two conclusions, and well, I see somebody now saying one conclusion: curse of the, I guess, caster, right? Instead of curse of the commentator. But yeah, we have a lot of you are saying two conclusions, and you know what? There are two conclusions. But I guarantee you that you will not have really gotten to, you will not have necessarily got to what are the two correct conclusions within this argument. So let's actually pick it apart and let's try to identify what the conclusions are. All right? So wrong, clearly. Okay. In countries where health insurance includes compensation for allergic reactions to prescribed medicines, reports of having suffered such allergies are twice as frequent as they are in countries where allergic reaction is not covered. That's a fact. So that's very clearly a premise. It can't really be a conclusion, right? So that seems to work. That seems to work just fine. I think that's the one that we can all say that's definitely a premise. Some analysts have argued correctly that since there's presently no conclusive test for medical allergy, bogus reports of medical allergies cannot be easily identified. Now, maybe you looked at the color coding and were like, okay, you know, there may be something going on here. But on the other hand, it says some analysts have argued. And if you read some analysts have argued, well, that means that that's the analyst's argument, right? So that means that that's got to be the analyst's conclusion. That means that that's what they're trying to convince us of. But yes, in fact, there is a trap here. And the trap is the word correctly. If we say that some analysts have argued correctly that so and so and so, it means that this is not something the analysts are trying to convince us of. This is not the analyst's argument. This is something that the analysts are telling us is very simply a fact. Some analysts have argued this correctly. Even the person who is the author of this argument is accepting this as a fact. So if we say some analysts have argued correctly that since there's presently no conclusive test, bogus reports cannot be easily identified. That means that this is just really telling us the fact that bogus reports cannot be easily identified. No one is questioning that. Bogus reports can't be easily identified. The author is totally accepting it, and that means that this statement here is also a premise. What about the next one? These analysts are, however, wrong to draw the further conclusion that in the countries with the higher rates of reported allergic reactions, half the reported cases are bogus. Now, a lot of you have identified this statement to be a conclusion, that these analysts are wrong and so and so. That means that the author is stating a point of view that seems to make sense, right? So that's a conclusion. Cool. What about the last statement? Clearly, in countries where health insurance does not include compensation for allergic reaction, people have little incentive to report medical allergies that they have actually suffered. Now, this is another statement that a lot of you have said is a conclusion, or at least a lot of you who actually tried to guess at what the conclusions are have guessed that this is a conclusion. But guess what? Something else is going on here. Clearly, in countries where health insurance does not include compensation, people have little incentive. So what is this telling us? This is telling us that when you don't get compensation for allergies, you have less to gain. There's little incentive. There's little reason, or there's less to gain from reporting medical allergies. There is less in it for you to report medical allergies. And that is just a fact. If they were trying to tell us that in countries where health insurance does not include compensation, people are not reporting because they are afraid, that would be a conclusion, because they're trying to convince us that people are indeed not reporting because they're afraid. But this is just saying that people have less incentive. This is just saying that people have less to gain by reporting. And that's just a fact. People have less to gain. They're not telling us, they're not trying to convince us about what people are doing. They're simply stating that, oh, people have less to gain here. So this, in fact, is also a premise, right? Where health insurance does not include compensation, people have little incentive to report because they're not going to get compensation. Whether they do report or not, no claims are being made about that. Cool. So now we've gone through a bunch of different premises and we're saying that this is the only statement with a conclusion. But if there are two conclusions, what are the two conclusions? Well, let's think about this logically. There's an author who's putting forward her opinion, all right? And there are analysts who are also putting forward their opinion. So the analyst's opinion is going to be a conclusion. The author's opinion is also going to be a conclusion. So what is the analyst's opinion and what is the author's opinion? The analyst's opinion is, in countries with higher rates of reported allergic reactions, half the reported cases are bogus. Because it says these analysts are, however, wrong to draw the further conclusion that. That means this is the analyst's conclusion. So the analysts are saying, right, in the places where there's more reports of allergies, half the reported cases are bogus. That's their opinion based on the facts that they have provided. The author is simply saying these analysts are talking crap, that these analysts are incorrect. The author is simply saying these analysts are wrong to draw that conclusion. And in fact, to say that somebody else's conclusion is wrong can in fact be one's own conclusion. So if I just say your conclusion is wrong, that is my conclusion. Your conclusion is XYZ, I say that you are wrong. My conclusion is that your conclusion of XYZ is incorrect. So within this one statement, there are actually two conclusions. These analysts are, however, wrong to draw the further conclusion that so. And the further conclusion that they have drawn is the analyst's conclusion. Now, you might start to see why the color coding is the way that it is. Because what is the main conclusion here? If we have two conclusions, what do we identify as the main conclusion? The main conclusion is always, and this even applies to other types of CR questions, the main conclusion is always the author's conclusion. What is the author's conclusion? These analysts are wrong. So this is conclusion main. This is conclusion that goes against, or conclusion other, right? These statements, that the allergies are twice as frequent and bogus reports cannot be identified. Well, these are facts that lead towards what the analysts have to say. So these would be premises that go against the main conclusion. Clearly so and so and so is a fact that supports the author. So this would be a premise that supports the main conclusion. So premise supports, premise against, conclusion main, conclusion against. And there we go. This is a very complicated argument. And by the way, you will often not get a question in which the argument is presented in as complicated a manner as this. However, even if you do, it is still possible to categorize every single statement into one of the four categories, right? So that's all it is that you really have to try to do. Okay, so now that we've figured out how to overcome the two main challenges, what we have to now figure out is, well, what are the steps that we have to follow? How can we have a strategy that works no matter what, right? The question is, and accounts for these two challenges effectively. 1 second, somebody has asked me to repeat what lines are the premises and conclusions. Let's just go back there for a second. Now, well, these are all premises, obviously, but these are premises that support the analyst's argument. So these would go in the bracket of premises against. This is a premise that supports the author's argument. So this would be premise support. This is the author's argument. So this is the conclusion main. And this is the analyst's argument. So this would be conclusion other, or conclusion that goes against that main conclusion, right? And that's really all there is to it. All right, so now putting all of this together, how can we come up with a composite strategy that works no matter what? Step one, identify the main conclusion of the argument. Now, hopefully you were doing this already. I would say that no matter what CR question you're trying to solve, you have to start by identifying the main conclusion of the argument. That is absolutely necessary and you can't not do that, right? And the reason that you got to do that is that if we say that we're putting a statement up as premise support or premise against, well, if it's premise support, supports what? It supports the main conclusion. If we say that a statement is premise against what? Against the main conclusion, right? If the premise supports another conclusion, well, it's clearly supporting that other conclusion. All premises support some conclusion or the other. But when we say premise support and premise against, we're saying supports the main argument, against the main argument. So that's why you gotta identify the main conclusion first. All of the other statements will become obvious based on your identification of that main conclusion. The next step is to pick the statement among the two boldface statements that you think will be easier to identify, right? So you have two boldface statements, right? Which one do you think will be easier to identify? Probably this one, because this is quite obviously the conclusion. So you can start here, right? And say, well, okay, I now know that this is the conclusion. So what do we then do? Vertically scan the options for that statement and eliminate those that don't match the corresponding meaning. Remember that you don't have to do the statements in order. You don't have to do the first statement first and the second statement second. You can pick whichever statement you think will be easier. And then for that statement, you go through answer options A, B, C, D, E. You look at whether for the second statement, does answer option A match it? Does answer option B match it? Does C match it? Does D match it? Does E match it? Some of them will, some of them won't. Whichever ones do not, you can eliminate those options. Then you move on to the other statement, but with the other statement, you only consider the options that have not been eliminated yet. Don't look at all of them, because why do you need to look at all of them? If statement 2 doesn't work for answer option B, then why would you look at statement 1 for answer option B? It doesn't matter. Only look at the remaining ones, and then you try to eliminate whatever other options are there, leaving you with just one option, right? Ultimately, the tip that I would give you in this situation would be to trust the quadrant and the tools that you already have. You don't need to worry about the argument. You don't need to worry about whether the argument is a correct argument or not. You don't need to worry about what the argument is, what might affect the argument and make it more likely or less likely. None of that stuff matters. The only thing you need to do is say, this argument is composed of these building blocks. What is each building block? Is this building block a premise or a conclusion? Cool, it's a premise. If it's a premise, does it support or attack the main conclusion? Or if it is a conclusion, is it the author's conclusion or is it somebody else's conclusion? As long as you trust this quadrant, it should be very easy for you to identify what each statement is and match it with the corresponding answer, right? Make sure that in the answer options as well, you're picking a statement that matches what you have seen in the argument itself to start with. All right, now that we've gone over the conceptual matter for this, let us move forward to the questions themselves. And now that we're done with the conceptual matter, right, of understanding what we need to do, there's 4 steps, right? Let's actually try some questions out. So I'm going to bring up a straightforward question, and I will mute my audio to help with the background noise. Unfortunately, I can't help that. But I will mute my audio and give you all 2 minutes to try to answer the question. All right, it's been 2 minutes, so I'd like to see some answers coming in and then we'll discuss how to solve this question. Okay, I only see 2 answers that have come in so far, 3 answers, and they're all different. So that means that a majority of you are wrong. So let's try and figure out what's going on that front then. Cool, I shall close the poll, right? And let's go over how we can solve this now. Okay, so we already saw this question at the start, so I'm not going to read it from start to finish. But if we take a look at the final statement, it says, it is likely that some of the fragments were at least large enough to have passed through Jupiter's outer atmosphere without being burned up. So it is likely that some of the fragments were at least large enough. This is what the author is trying to convince us of. So that means that the second statement has got to be a conclusion. Let's take a look at the answer options and see whether that indeed is correct or not, right? Or let's see which answer options rather match that interpretation. Well, answer option A says the second is part of that explanation. Well, an explanation for something generally is going to be a conclusion because you have facts and then you have an explanation for those facts. So we could say that A stays in the mix for now. B says, right, the second is that conclusion. Excellent. So B stays in the mix as well. C says the second provides evidence to support the conclusion. Now, whenever you see the word support, right, that's got to be a premise because a conclusion is never going to support another conclusion. A conclusion is supported by the facts. So facts or premises can do the supporting, and the conclusion is what is supported by those premises. So if we say that the second is evidence in support of that conclusion, we then can say that answer option C doesn't work in this case. We can eliminate it. D says the second acknowledges a consideration that weighs against the conclusion. Again, weighing against the conclusion means it's a premise, because only the premise can support or go against. D is out as well. E says the second is that conclusion. Cool. So C and D are out. We have A, B, and E. And those are the options that you guys picked. So clearly statement 1, that was pretty straightforward, right? Or rather statement 2, that was pretty straightforward. Let's take a look at statement 1 then. The fragments themselves almost certainly contain no sulfur, but many astronomers believe that the cloud layer below Jupiter's outer atmosphere does contain sulfur. Now that is simply a fact, right? And this fact is telling us that many astronomers believe that the cloud layer below Jupiter's atmosphere does contain sulfur. What this means is that it is a premise and it is leading towards the author's conclusion. It's not going against the author's conclusion, it's leading towards it, right? Because Jupiter's outer atmosphere does contain sulfur. There's no sulfur in so and so other place. Therefore, it's very likely that the fragments were large enough to go through the outer atmosphere, right? That seems to line up. So we can go ahead and get rid of B. The first acknowledges a consideration that weighs against the conclusion because it is not a premise that goes against. A says, the first presents a circumstance for which the astronomer offers an explanation. So the first presents a circumstance, which would be similar to being a premise, for which the astronomer offers an explanation. So there's a premise and the astronomer gives a conclusion for this premise. But between A and E, E is much more clear in saying that the first is a judgment advanced in support of the conclusion of the argument. Whereas the first one just says it's a circumstance, the astronomer gives an explanation, so that means there is a conclusion related to the premise, but it doesn't tell us whether that premise supports or goes against the main argument. And for that reason, we can then say that, well, answer option E is the answer that wins out over here. The first is a judgment offered in support. So that means that it is premise support. The second is that conclusion. The second is the main conclusion of the argument here, right? So essentially that's what you're trying to do. You pick the statement that's easier, eliminate the options that don't work. then you take a look at the other statement and see what other options you can eliminate based on that. Some things that you will get better at with practicing more boldface questions are to recognize the words that the GMAT uses when it means premise or conclusion. A circumstance, that's a premise. A consideration, that's a premise. Anything that is in support, well, evidence is definitely a premise. The word judgment is a bit more confusing because a judgment can be a judgment based on the facts. You could have a judgment which leads to some conclusion as well. So the word judgment is a little bit more complex. You can't just say with the word judgment whether we're talking about a premise or a conclusion. However, right, if you find yourself in this stage and you find yourself confused with this situation, right, what do I do when I see a judgment? What do I do if I just say if it just says the first is a statement? Well, that's very ambiguous, right? What you have to look at is what I call the equilibrium of support. So you have a premise will always do the supporting, and a conclusion will always be supported. A conclusion can never support anything else because a conclusion is the thing you're trying to convince someone of in the first place, which people may not already believe. So that means the conclusion is not going to support anything else because it itself needs support. A premise, on the other hand, can support other things, right? So that's the difference between these two. All right, let's try a slightly trickier question, right? Let me just take some questions first, right? How did we eliminate A again? So A says the first presents a circumstance for which the astronomer offers an explanation. It's a premise, but it is not telling us whether that premise supports or goes against the main conclusion of the argument. On the other hand, answer option E very clearly tells us that the first is a judgment that is in support. Something else that you might be able to identify as well is this. The second is part of that explanation. Now, since sulfur would have seeped into the outer atmosphere, that's not really part of the explanation either. So what that means is that this is really the entire explanation, or this is really the entirety of the conclusion. But I would not use that as a tool to eliminate. A much more effective tool to eliminate would be the approach offered to eliminate A, which is that the first presents a circumstance. Cool, but it doesn't tell us about whether this circumstance helps the conclusion along or whether it hurts the conclusion in some way. That would be the most effective way then to eliminate answer option A. All right, let's try a more tricky question. And again, I'll give you all 2 minutes. You can then give your answers and we will then explain what's going on. So let me put 2 minutes on the clock and I'll open the poll. All right, I see some answers have come in, a few more, so that's nice. Nice to see a few more answers in. And once again, unfortunately, because you've all picked such different answers, it's not possible for a majority of you to be correct. However, at least I can see that one of the most picked answers is in fact the correct answer here. So let's get into it. The right answer for this question is actually answer option E. And it's good that at least 4 of you got to this point. But this question is tricky. And let's try to look at what about this question makes it so tricky that makes it a true challenge. All right. So by the way, somebody had asked a question before, which I thought was very relevant, which was, whoops. Yeah, are we supposed to consider the author's argument or the person? Now, like in this case, in the previous question was the astronomer. Well, if the astronomer is the one saying everything, then the astronomer is the author in that situation. So what you would have to then say is that there's functionally no difference between the two, and you can consider them to be one and the same. Same with this question over here. There's a city official making some kind of statement, right? And we are supposed to consider that city official to be the author. If the author is talking about someone else and she has something to say about that someone else, then we can maybe say that the author is separate from whoever has been mentioned within the argument. So once again, if we move back to this city official question right here, right, the city official is the only person talking, and therefore the author's argument is one and the same. The city official says, at City Hospital, uninsured patients tend to have shorter stays and fewer procedures performed than do insured patients. And even though insured patients on average have slightly less serious medical problems at time of admission than uninsured patients. Critics of the hospital have concluded that uninsured patients are not receiving proper medical care. However, this conclusion is almost certainly false. Careful investigation has recently shown two things. Insured patients have much longer stays than necessary, and they tend to have more procedures performed than are medically necessary. Okay, well, it says in the city official's argument, so that also should make it clear to you that the city official and the author are to be treated as one and the same in this circumstance. Now, what is the conclusion of the city official? Some of you might have started along the lines of saying this. Careful investigation has recently shown us two things. However, if the investigation has shown us these things, this is an observation backed by data. This is not a conclusion based upon those observations, right? And that's the difference between a premise and a conclusion. A premise is the data itself. The conclusion is a belief that you have upon that data. So insured patients have much longer stays and they tend to have more procedures. That doesn't have anything to do with, right, the insured patients. That has nothing to do with what the city official is actually trying to convince us of. How does the city official say this? She states it, she says that these are things that studies have shown as facts. What she is actually trying to convince us of will be something that is based upon these facts. Well, it's hard to see something that she's trying to convince us of based upon these facts. But what we can certainly see is that critics of the hospital have concluded that, well, whatever comes here has got to be what the critics have concluded. Uninsured patients are not receiving proper medical care. So we now at least know that statement number one is a conclusion. We also know that it's not the main conclusion of the argument, right? So it must be in the category of conclusion other. Let's go through the options and see what we can eliminate there. The first states the conclusion of the city official's argument, not correct. The first is used to support the conclusion of the city official's argument, certainly not correct. It's not supporting and it's not the conclusion of the city official. C says the first was used to support the conclusion drawn by the hospital critics. Now, a lot of you picked C, but what we have to see is this, that when we say support the conclusion, only a premise can support the conclusion. Premises do the supporting, conclusions are supported. If you see a statement, if you see an option which says, the first is a statement that supports so and so and so, then you automatically can say, hey, that's a premise because it is supporting. If you see a statement which says, the first is a statement which is supported by so and so, automatically you can say that it's a conclusion because it is supported. And that's really what you want to get better at and more comfortable with when you practice boldface questions. So the first was used to support the conclusion. Absolutely not, because the first was the conclusion of the hospital critics. So we can get rid of C as well. D says, the first was used to support the conclusion drawn by hospital critics. Well, that's wrong as well. So just by recognizing that the first statement is the conclusion that goes against the main conclusion, we can straight up go ahead and say that it's answer option E. Why is this question challenging? This question is challenging because it's hard to identify the main conclusion. Well, what is the main conclusion? The main conclusion, and we've seen this before, is simply the city official saying that the other guys are wrong. The critics are saying one thing, the city official is saying, well, these people are incorrect. And that in itself can be a conclusion. So the first states the position, which is the conclusion, obviously, that the city official's argument opposes. So that's a conclusion that goes against. The second states the conclusion of the city official's argument. The second is the conclusion of the city official's argument. So both of these statements here are conclusion statements. How can we identify that? We can identify that because the other statements which are showing us things have got to be premises. Critics of the hospital have concluded that. Well, that's telling us that this is what the critics of this is the conclusion that goes against. And calling it out as wrong can in itself be a conclusion. So therefore, the main conclusion of the argument is this conclusion is false. This being uninsured patients are not properly receiving medical care. And therefore, answer option E is the right answer here. Now, in this question, I would agree with the fact that it is hard to identify the main conclusion because the statement is simply saying that the other one is false. One, you can keep in mind that that is a possible way of identifying a conclusion. That can help. Two, if you have a hard time doing that, well, at least see what the other people are trying to conclude. And that can help you out a lot as well. In this case, simply being able to recognize that uninsured patients are not receiving proper medical care is the conclusion, not supporting the conclusion, but is the conclusion of the hospital critics. We can then go ahead and say, well, answers A, B, C, and D are incorrect. It's got to be answer option E and nothing else, right? And therefore, answer option E is the correct answer here. All right, it's already 5:21. So you can totally leave if you want, right? But I do think that we could benefit from doing one last question, one that's actually a little bit more challenging. So let's take a shot at that. About Newton and Leibniz. Now, once again, it's in the historian's reasoning. This means that the historian and the author are one and the same. The historian is the person making his or her argument. Once again, I'm going to put a couple of minutes on. I'll open up the poll and then you can give me some answers. All right, great. So I've seen some answers come in. A lot more of you have picked D than any of the other options. More of you have answered the question as well. I like to see that. And many of you have picked answer option D. Clearly, right, this session seems to have worked because D is in fact the right answer here. So I'm closing the poll and 64% of you picked answer option D. That's fantastic, right? So give yourself a pat on the back. You've clearly made some progress. This question is marked as a fairly hard one, in the official guides in which it was present. So it's, certainly not one of the easier ones out there. But, right, good job getting to the correct answer. So let's try and figure out now how we can do this. The first thing is this, right? Our job is always to try and identify the main conclusion. And as we've seen, you can often have like just the one conclusion, as is true for most arguments, but you can sometimes have more than one conclusion. You can sometimes have two conclusions as well, and that definitely makes the question a little bit harder. However, there is more going on in this question than meets the eye, right? So firstly, I'm just going to take, let's see if there are any other questions. Yeah, somebody said, does the word evidence mean premise? Does the word evidence mean premise? Not in day-to-day English, but when you're solving GMAT questions, you can take evidence as an equivalent statement to a premise, because if it's an evidence, it's a finding, and we're using that evidence to support a conclusion. So that makes that evidence a premise in this case, right? But okay, so there's more that meets the eye over here. So we clearly have a historian, so that means the historian is got to have his or her own conclusion. Now, what are the conclusions in this argument? It has traditionally been thought that these discoveries were independent. Well, that means that there is a traditional view that the discoveries were independent of each other. That's got to be something that people believed, right? So that means that it is a view. If we don't know this as a fact, that means it's got to be a conclusion. It has traditionally been thought that the discoveries are independent. So that's one. Several scholars have blah, blah, blah. Since the notes were written before the development, it is virtually certain that the traditional view is false. Wow, okay, well, that too now would be a conclusion, because we have some facts which are leading us to say that the traditional view is false. So there's a traditional view, the discoveries are independent. There's the fact that the traditional view, there's not the fact, but there's the conclusion that the traditional view is false, which is, it's just saying that the traditional view is false, but it is suggesting behind it that Leibniz copied Newton. So that too is a point of view at play. But does the historian believe either of these points of view? Not actually. We see later that Leibniz's notes are limited to early sections of Newton's book, sections that precede the ones in which Newton's calculus concepts and techniques are presented. So the first conclusion is they did it independently. The second conclusion is, well, Leibniz copied Newton. This tells us that, well, Leibniz copied Newton a bit, but it's not necessary that Leibniz totally copied Newton for inventing calculus. So, is this then our third conclusion? Well, actually, no, because again, if you look at this, Leibniz's notes are limited to early sections of Newton's book. That's a fact. Sections that precede the ones in which the techniques are presented. These things together are facts. These facts can support or lead to a conclusion, which is actually this statement over here. A more cautious conclusion than this is called for, however, right? So the first conclusion, the discoveries were independent. The second conclusion, the traditional view is false. But what the historian is trying to tell us is that she's trying to say that, well, actually, we have to be a little bit more cautious. It's a bit of both. It's not that Newton totally copied Leibniz. It's not that the discoveries were totally independent either. We have to be a bit cautious in how we present our conclusion. And the fact that we have to be cautious and we cannot necessarily conclude anything definitively is in itself a conclusion. Any of you who are scientists and are good scientists know that the discovery that we did not find anything new is as much a conclusion as the discovery that we found something new. Us not being able to decide something one way or the other is very much a conclusion, and is just as much a conclusion as deciding something one way or the other. Therefore, right, the conclusions in this argument are it has traditionally been thought that these discoveries were independent. It's virtually certain that the traditional view is false, and a more cautious conclusion than this is called for, however. And this is the historian's conclusion. The other two conclusions automatically go into the quadrant of conclusion other. But neither of those statements are bolded. That means that the first thing that we can at least say is that both of the statements that are bolded are premises. This statement is a premise which actually supports the author's conclusion. So let's start with that. Why not? The second is evidence that has been used to support an opposing position. Opposing to what? Opposing to what the historian defends. That's not correct. A is out. The second is that position. The second is not any position. It is a premise. So therefore, we can go ahead and get rid of that. C says, the second provides evidence against that intermediate conclusion. Ooh, that's interesting now. What intermediate conclusion? There's some intermediate conclusion over here. You know what? That's a very complicated statement. Now, imagine you get this question as question number 34 after you've done an RC passage. That sucks. You don't want to read this, right? So let's actually make our job a bit easier. It says it provides evidence against something. You know what? It's providing evidence. Let's just keep C in the mix for now. We'll break our brains over C once we've eliminated other options, and then we only have to break our brain over one option. D says, the second is evidence offered in support of the historian's own position. Great. It's evidence to support the historian's position. Fantastic. E says, the second is further information that substantiates that evidence. Information is never going to substantiate evidence. It is going to substantiate a conclusion. And therefore, just from the wording of this, E is also automatically incorrect. So nice. We got rid of A, B, and E, and we're just left with C and D now. Well, how do we choose between C and D? Now we can actually break our brain over C. Well, what does the first statement say? Several scholars have argued that since the book includes a presentation of Newton's calculus concepts and techniques. Okay, so this is telling us that Leibniz's book, right, contains the presentation of Newton's calculus concepts and techniques. And it's saying since the book contains this, it's virtually certain that the traditional view is false. So that means that this is a premise that supports traditional view is false. So this is a premise, but it doesn't support the main conclusion. It supports some other conclusion. So we can categorize it as premise against. Let's take a look at C now. The first provides evidence in support of an intermediate conclusion. Well, it is supporting an intermediate conclusion. It's not supporting the main conclusion. So far, so good. That is drawn to provide support for the overall position. So it's saying that the intermediate conclusion eventually supports the historian's own position. But the intermediate conclusion does not support the historian's own position. And for that reason, we can say that answer option C is incorrect. And that just leaves us with D. Let's just look at D to confirm it. The first is evidence that has been used to support a conclusion that the historian criticizes. First is evidence. It's supporting a conclusion. Well, all evidence supports a conclusion, but it's supporting a conclusion that the historian criticizes. That means that it is a premise that goes against the historian's conclusion. The historian is criticizing this conclusion. In fact, what is even nicer about it is that it doesn't straight up say historian opposes. It says historian criticizes, which is actually the right word here, right? It's not like the historian is totally against the fact that the traditional view is false. He or she is just saying that, like, well, I criticize this conclusion because my conclusion is kind of in the middle. So that's actually really nice wording there, but we don't have to get into the details of that wording. As long as it fits the quadrant, it fits the quadrant, so we're good to go. The second statement says the second is evidence offered in support of the historian's own position. And in fact, yes, indeed, it is. It is evidence that supports the historian's own position. And therefore, we can conclude that answer option D actually is the right answer in this circumstance. Now, let's say, isn't more cautious conclusion supporting a isn't sort of a supporting conclusion towards the traditional view? We can get into the nitty-gritty of it. What I would say is that for the purposes of the GMAT, the fact that it is separate from the traditional view means that you got to say that it's criticizing the traditional view and it is criticizing the fact that the traditional view is false. because the historian is saying it's virtually certain that the traditional view is false. So the historian criticizes the traditional view. She's also criticizing the fact that the traditional view is false. So for all intents and purposes, right, the quadrant ultimately works. You don't want to say that the main conclusion kind of supports or kind of leads towards the others, right? Like if you say that you need skill to do well on the GMAT, if your conclusion is that you need skill to do well on the GMAT, and my conclusion is you need skill and luck to do well on the GMAT, it's not like my conclusion is opposing yours, but there's a reason that I uttered my conclusion in the first place, because it's different from yours in some respect. It's not like it's going against yours, but it is different. So the fact that it is different automatically means that you can put it in conclusion other. So for functional purposes, right, you can simply say, well, conclusion other, and that's that, and that's all you need to do. If you don't need to think about whether it supports the traditional view more, or whether it supports the fact that the traditional view is false more, or which one it might be closer to on the spectrum. Those are interesting things if you're actually interested in knowing who invented calculus. But when we're solving the GMAT question, we don't care who invented calculus. What we care about are the building blocks of the argument and how the historian is putting forward her argument. We don't care whether that argument is actually a sound one or what it's actually trying to say. We just care about whether the statement is a conclusion, whether the statement is a fact. And that's really all there is to it, right? I feel like you guys did make some progress, because you definitely did a lot better on the third question than you did on the first two. And I will say this, the third question is meant to be a bit harder than the first two. So good on you all for getting it right. I just want to finish with one final poll, right, which is whether you felt like this webinar was helpful to you or not, right? So I am launching this poll. You can answer it and then you can leave, no big deal, right? Even if you don't answer it, it's not like it's the end of the world, but you can go ahead and, put in some answers. If you felt it was helpful, well, that's great. That's good for me. It's not like the time that I spent trying to deal with the technical issues before was a waste. I feel like that's nice as well. It's always good to see, the people that I'm trying to teach something succeed or, make progress in their learning. So thank you all for attending so much. Take care, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Have a great one. Thanks a lot.